The summer evening air was thick and humid as Marcus Washington drove his old blue pickup truck down Maple Street. He had just finished another long day at Henderson Hardware Store, where he worked as a sales associate. His back ached from lifting heavy boxes, and his feet were sore from standing on concrete floors for 8 hours straight. All he wanted was to get home to his wife, Sarah, and maybe catch the evening news before dinner. Marcus was a quiet man who kept to himself most of the time. At 45 years old, he had seen enough of the world during his military service to appreciate the simple things in life. A steady job, a loving wife, and a small house in a decent neighborhood were all he needed to be content. He never looked for trouble, and trouble had never really found him until today. The red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror without warning. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he pulled over to the side of the road. He could not think of anything he had done wrong. He had been driving the speed limit and staying in his lane. His registration was current, and his license was valid. Still, his hands began to shake slightly as he rolled down his window and waited. Officer Tommy Stevens was only 24 years old and had been on the police force for just 6 months. He was eager to prove himself to his senior officers, and sometimes that eagerness made him act tougher than he really was. When he saw the broken taillight on the pickup truck, he decided it was a good opportunity to make a stop and show he was paying attention to details. Tommy walked up to the driver's side window with his hand resting on his service weapon. This was something they had taught him at the police academy. Always be ready for anything, they said. Always maintain control of the situation. Marcus looked up at the young officer and tried to smile despite his nervousness. "Good evening, officer," Marcus said politely. "Is there a problem with my driving tonight?" Tommy looked down at Marcus with what he thought was an authoritative expression. "Your left taillight is broken, sir. I need to see your license, registration, and proof of insurance." Marcus reached slowly into his glove compartment to get his registration and insurance papers. He then carefully pulled his wallet from his back pocket and handed over his driver's license. "Yes, sir, I was not aware the taillight was broken. I can get that fixed first thing tomorrow morning." Tommy took the documents and walked back to his patrol car to run Marcus' information through the computer system. Everything came back clean. No warrants, no unpaid tickets, no criminal history. Marcus Washington was exactly what he appeared to be, a working man trying to get home after a long day. But when Tommy returned to the truck, something had changed in his attitude. Maybe it was the way Marcus had looked at him, or maybe it was just the stress of being a new officer trying to prove himself. Whatever it was, Tommy decided that this simple traffic stop needed to become something more serious. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," Tommy commanded in a voice that was trying too hard to sound tough. Marcus was confused by the request. "Officer, is that really necessary for a broken taillight? I have given you all my documents, and everything appears to be in order." The question seemed to make Tommy angry. "I said step out of the vehicle, sir. Do not make me ask you again." Marcus could feel the situation starting to spiral out of control, but he remained calm. "With respect, officer, I would like to know why you are asking me to exit my vehicle for what appears to be a simple equipment violation." That simple question would change everything that happened next. Tommy interpreted Marcus' polite inquiry as defiance and disrespect. In his young mind, anyone who questioned his authority was challenging his position as a police officer. The military medals hanging from Marcus' rearview mirror went completely unnoticed as Tommy called for backup and prepared to escalate a routine traffic stop into something much more serious. The evening that had started so peacefully was about to become a nightmare that would test everything Marcus believed about justice and fairness in the country he had served with honor and distinction. The county jail cell was cold and smelled like disinfectant mixed with stale cigarettes. Marcus sat on the thin mattress that covered a metal bench attached to the concrete wall. The fluorescent lights above buzzed constantly and never turned off completely. Even at midnight, there was always a dim glow that made it impossible to tell what time it was without looking at the clock on the wall outside the cell. Marcus shared the small cell with 3 other men. There was Bobby, a middle-aged man who had been arrested for public intoxication after losing his job at the factory. Next to him sat James, a young guy who could not have been more than 20 years old. James had been caught shoplifting food from a grocery store because his family had run out of money for the month. The third man was named Carl, and he kept to himself in the corner, mumbling quietly about how the whole system was rigged against people like them. The arrest had happened so fast that Marcus still could not believe it was real. 1 minute, he was sitting in his truck answering Officer Stevens' questions politely. The next minute, 2 more police cars had arrived, and he was being handcuffed and charged with resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. He had never raised his voice or made any threatening movements, but somehow the situation had exploded beyond anything he could have imagined. As Marcus lay on the uncomfortable mattress, his mind wandered back to Afghanistan. He remembered the first time he had been deployed overseas in 2003. He was just a young sergeant then, full of pride about serving his country. The desert was harsh and unforgiving, but his fellow soldiers had become like brothers to him. They did not care what color his skin was or where he had grown up. All that mattered was whether you could be trusted to watch their backs when danger came calling. He thought about the day in Kandahar province when everything had changed for his unit. They were on a routine patrol through a village when the Taliban fighters had ambushed them from 3 different directions. Marcus could still hear the sound of bullets whistling past his head and the shouts of his squad members calling for cover. That was the day he had earned his Bronze Star for valor. The ambush had lasted for almost 2 hours. Several of his fellow soldiers had been wounded and trapped behind a broken-down wall with no way to escape. Marcus had crawled through enemy fire 3 different times to drag his wounded brothers to safety. He had used his own body as a shield to protect a young private who had been shot in the leg. When the fighting was finally over, 11 soldiers owed their lives to Marcus Washington. His commanding officer, General Robert Hayes, had personally pinned the Bronze Star on Marcus' uniform during the ceremony. The general had looked him in the eye and said that Marcus represented the very best of what it meant to be an American soldier. Those words had meant everything to Marcus because they came from a man he respected more than anyone else in the military. Now, as he sat in this jail cell, Marcus wondered what General Hayes would think if he could see him now. Here was a decorated war veteran being treated like a common criminal for simply asking questions about his constitutional rights. The irony was not lost on him that he had fought overseas to protect the freedoms that seemed to mean so little to the officers who had arrested him. The other men in the cell had gradually fallen asleep, but Marcus remained wide awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought about his wife Sarah, who was probably lying in their bed at home wondering where he was and why he had not come home from work. She would be worried sick, not knowing if something terrible had happened to him. Marcus was finally allowed to make his one phone call at midnight. Sarah answered on the first ring and immediately began crying when she heard his voice. He tried to explain what had happened, but even to his own ears, the story sounded unbelievable. A traffic stop for a broken taillight had somehow turned into a night in jail and serious criminal charges. The long night stretched ahead of him as Marcus tried to prepare himself for whatever would happen in court the next morning. The morning sun barely filtered through the small windows of the county courthouse as Marcus was led from the jail in handcuffs. His orange jumpsuit made him feel like he had already been convicted of a crime before even seeing the judge. The bailiff walked him through a side door into the courtroom where he would face the charges that had been filed against him. Judge Patricia Holbrook had been on the bench for 20 years and thought she had seen every type of criminal case imaginable. She was a stern woman in her mid-60s who prided herself on running an efficient courtroom. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her black robe made her look even more intimidating than she already was. She had a reputation for being tough on defendants who showed any sign of disrespect or defiance. The courtroom was mostly empty at 9 in the morning. Only a few other defendants sat in the gallery waiting for their cases to be called. Marcus could see his wife Sarah sitting in the back row with tears in her eyes. She had driven to the courthouse as soon as visiting hours ended at the jail. Sarah had barely slept all night worrying about her husband and wondering how their quiet life had suddenly turned upside down. Near the door, an older gentleman in a neat gray suit had quietly entered and taken a seat. He appeared to be in his 70s with silver hair and the straight posture of someone who had spent many years in the military. Most people would not have noticed him, but there was something about his presence that commanded respect, even when he was sitting quietly. When Marcus' case was called, he stood up as straight as he could manage while wearing handcuffs. The prosecutor was a young woman who looked like she had just graduated from law school. She read the charges in a monotone voice that made everything sound routine and unimportant. Resisting arrest and disorderly conduct, she announced to the court without looking up from her paperwork. Judge Holbrook looked down at Marcus from her high bench with obvious displeasure. She had already made up her mind about what kind of person he was based on the charges alone. In her experience, most people who got arrested for resisting arrest were troublemakers who did not respect authority. She did not bother to read the police report carefully or ask any questions about what had actually happened during the traffic stop. Marcus tried to stand with dignity despite the uncomfortable handcuffs and the embarrassing orange jumpsuit. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom looking at him and judging him. This was not how he had imagined he would ever find himself appearing before a judge. In all his 45 years, he had never been arrested or even gotten a serious traffic ticket. The bailiff standing next to Marcus was a large man who seemed ready to jump into action if any defendant caused trouble. He kept one hand near his weapon and watched Marcus carefully, as if expecting him to try something dangerous. The whole atmosphere in the courtroom seemed designed to make defendants feel small and powerless. Judge Holbrook shuffled through some papers on her desk before looking back up at Marcus. She had already decided that this was going to be a quick case that she could dispose of easily. In her mind, Marcus was just another defendant who needed to learn some respect for law enforcement officers. She did not see a decorated war veteran standing before her. She only saw someone who had been arrested for causing trouble. The prosecutor finished reading the charges and sat down at her table. Now it was time for Judge Holbrook to take control of the situation and teach this defendant a lesson about respecting authority. She had done this hundreds of times before and expected this case to go exactly like all the others. But the older gentleman sitting near the door was paying very close attention to everything that was happening. His experienced eyes were taking in every detail of the proceedings, and he was beginning to realize that something was very wrong with this case. Judge Holbrook cleared her throat and stared down at Marcus with the cold expression she reserved for defendants she had already decided were guilty. Her voice cut through the quiet courtroom like a sharp blade when she finally spoke. The sound echoed off the wooden walls and made everyone sit up straighter in their seats. "Mr. Washington," she began in a tone that left no doubt about her feelings toward him. "This kind of behavior is completely unacceptable in our community. You have been charged with resisting arrest and disorderly conduct after showing disrespect to a police officer who was simply doing his job." Marcus felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his face calm and respectful. He had learned during his military service how to maintain his composure even when facing hostile situations. His years in Afghanistan had taught him that staying cool under pressure was often the difference between life and death. "Officer Stevens is a fine young man who serves this community with honor," Judge Holbrook continued. "He pulled you over for a broken taillight, which is a legitimate safety concern. Instead of accepting the citation like a responsible citizen, you chose to argue and create a confrontation." The young prosecutor nodded along with everything the judge was saying, even though she had not bothered to interview any witnesses or review the case thoroughly. Officer Stevens sat in the front row looking uncomfortable, but saying nothing about what had really happened during the traffic stop. Judge Holbrook leaned forward on her bench and pointed her finger directly at Marcus. "You will apologize to Officer Stevens right now for your disrespectful conduct, or I will hold you in contempt of court. This is not a request, Mr. Washington. This is an order." Marcus felt his blood pressure rising, but his military training helped him stay focused. He had faced enemy fire in Afghanistan, and he had learned how to stand his ground when he knew he was right. He looked up at the judge with respect, but also with quiet determination. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I do not believe I did anything wrong," Marcus said in a clear, steady voice. I was polite to Officer Stevens throughout our entire encounter. I simply asked why I was being asked to exit my vehicle for what seemed like a minor equipment violation. The judge's face turned red with anger at what she saw as continued defiance. Her 20 years on the bench had convinced her that defendants who argued with her orders were always troublemakers who needed to be taught harsh lessons. "Do not dare argue with me in my courtroom," she shouted loud enough that her voice carried into the hallway outside. "You will apologize to this officer immediately, or you will spend another night in jail while we sort this out. I have had enough of your attitude, Mr. Washington." Sarah gripped the edge of the wooden bench where she was sitting. Tears began forming in her eyes as she watched her husband being treated with such disrespect. She wanted to stand up and defend him, but she knew that would only make things worse for both of them. The older gentleman near the door leaned forward slightly in his seat. His experienced eyes were studying every detail of what was happening. He had seen many young soldiers face unfair treatment over the years, and he recognized the signs of injustice when he saw them. Marcus remained standing at attention, just as he had learned to do during his years of military service. His voice remained respectful but firm when he responded to the judge's demand. "Your Honor, I understand that you expect respect in your courtroom, and I am trying to show that respect. However, I also served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan, defending the Constitution and the rights it guarantees to all American citizens. I was respectful to Officer Stevens from the beginning of our encounter to the end." Judge Holbrook was becoming more angry with each word Marcus spoke. In her mind, any defendant who mentioned their military service was just trying to get sympathy and avoid taking responsibility for their actions. "I do not care about your military service," she declared loudly. "In my courtroom, you follow my rules, and my rules say you will apologize to this officer right now." The harsh words seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a fire. Everyone in the courtroom could feel the tension building as Marcus prepared to make a decision that would change everything that happened next. He could apologize for something he had not done and probably go home to his wife, or he could continue standing up for what he believed was right and face whatever consequences the judge decided to impose on him. Marcus took a deep breath and felt something familiar stirring inside him. It was the same feeling he had experienced in Afghanistan, when enemy soldiers were shooting at his unit, and he had to decide whether to take cover or risk his life to save his fellow soldiers. This was a different kind of battlefield, but the choice between doing what was easy and doing what was right felt exactly the same. He straightened his shoulders and looked directly at Judge Holbrook with the quiet confidence that had earned him respect from every commanding officer he had ever served under. His voice was clear and steady when he spoke, and everyone in the courtroom could hear the strength behind his words. "Your Honor, I have great respect for this court and for the law that it represents," Marcus said without breaking eye contact with the judge. "I also have great respect for the police officers who risk their lives every day to keep our communities safe. However, I cannot apologize for something I did not do." Judge Holbrook felt her anger reaching a boiling point. No defendant had ever challenged her authority so directly in her own courtroom. She was used to people backing down when she raised her voice and made her demands clear. This man was different, and that made her even more determined to break his spirit. "Mr. Washington, you are testing my patience, and I am warning you that I will not tolerate this kind of defiance," she said through clenched teeth. "You will apologize to Officer Stevens immediately or face the consequences of your stubbornness." Marcus remained standing at perfect military attention, just as he had learned during his basic training 25 years earlier. His hands were at his sides and his back was straight despite the uncomfortable handcuffs. He spoke with the same respect he had always shown to his superior officers, even when he disagreed with their orders. "Your Honor, I served my country for 12 years, including 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan. I earned the Bronze Star for valor after saving 11 members of my unit during a Taliban ambush. I have never been anything less than respectful to any law enforcement officer, including Officer Stevens." The mention of his Bronze Star caused several people in the courtroom to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Even the bailiff looked surprised to learn that this defendant was a decorated war hero. But Judge Holbrook was too angry to be impressed by military honors or combat experience. "I told you I do not care about your military service," she practically screamed at him. "You are in my courtroom now, and you will follow my orders. Apologize to this officer right now, or I will cite you for contempt of court and send you back to jail." Sarah could not hold back her tears any longer as she watched her husband being humiliated by someone who should have been interested in hearing the truth about what had happened. She knew Marcus better than anyone else in the world, and she knew he would never disrespect a police officer or anyone else in authority. The older gentleman near the door was now sitting on the edge of his seat, paying close attention to every word being spoken. Something about Marcus reminded him of the many brave soldiers he had known during his own military career. The way Marcus carried himself and spoke with quiet dignity, even under extreme pressure, told this experienced observer that he was witnessing something special. Marcus felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him like the hot desert sun in Afghanistan. He knew that his next words would determine not just what happened to him today, but also whether he could look at himself in the mirror tomorrow morning with any self-respect remaining. "Your Honor, I understand that you have the power to send me back to jail," Marcus said quietly. "But I took an oath when I joined the Army to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. That Constitution guarantees certain rights to all citizens, including the right to ask questions when we are stopped by police officers." Judge Holbrook was so angry now that her hands were shaking as she shuffled through papers on her desk, looking for the contempt of court form she was planning to fill out. She had never encountered a defendant who refused to back down when faced with the threat of additional jail time. The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of Sarah quietly crying in the back row. Everyone present seemed to understand that they were witnessing something important, even if they were not sure exactly what it was. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like the air before a thunderstorm when lightning is about to strike. Judge Holbrook was reaching for her gavel to cite Marcus for contempt of court when the heavy wooden door at the back of the courtroom opened with a soft creak. The sound was barely audible, but somehow it commanded the attention of everyone in the room. All eyes turned toward the entrance as the older gentleman who had been sitting quietly near the door slowly rose to his feet. The man was tall and distinguished-looking with silver hair that was perfectly calm despite his age. His gray suit was pressed to perfection, and there was a small American flag pin on his left label that caught the light from the courtroom windows. Everything about his appearance suggested someone who had spent many years in positions of authority and responsibility. But it was more than just his clothing that made people notice him. There was something in the way he carried himself that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. His posture was unmistakably military, with shoulders back and head held high. When he moved, it was with the confident stride of someone who had commanded respect from others for most of his adult life. Judge Holbrook paused in the middle of reaching for her gavel, looking confused and slightly annoyed by the interruption. She was not used to people moving around in her courtroom without permission, especially when she was in the middle of dealing with a difficult defendant. "Excuse me, sir," she said in an irritated tone, "but court is in session. You will need to wait your turn or step outside until we are finished with this case." The distinguished gentleman walked slowly down the center aisle of the courtroom. His leather shoes made soft clicking sounds on the polished floor, and each step seemed deliberate and purposeful. He moved with the kind of quiet authority that made people want to listen even before he spoke his first word. Marcus watched the man approaching and felt something familiar about him, though he could not immediately place where he might have seen him before. There was something about the way the stranger moved that reminded Marcus of his commanding officers in Afghanistan. This was clearly someone who had spent time in the military and had reached positions of significant responsibility. Sarah stopped crying for a moment as she watched the mysterious man walking toward the front of the courtroom. Something told her that this unexpected visitor might be important to what was happening to her husband. She found herself holding her breath as she waited to see what would happen next. The man stopped about halfway down the aisle and raised his right hand in a polite gesture toward Judge Holbrook. His voice when he spoke was calm and measured, but it carried the kind of authority that made everyone in the room pay attention. "Your Honor, I apologize for interrupting your proceedings," he said with perfect courtesy. "I understand that court is in session, and I would not normally interfere with judicial business. However, I believe there is something very important you should know about Sergeant Washington." Judge Holbrook was taken aback by the man's formal manner of speaking and his obvious confidence in addressing the court. Most people who entered her courtroom seemed nervous or intimidated, but this man appeared completely comfortable speaking in front of judges and lawyers. "Sir, I appreciate your concern," the judge replied in a slightly less harsh tone than she had been using with Marcus, "but this court is in the middle of dealing with a defendant who has been charged with serious crimes. Unless you are an attorney representing Mr. Washington, I must ask you to wait outside." The older gentleman smiled slightly, and there was something in his expression that suggested he was used to being underestimated by people who did not know who he was. He had spent decades in situations where his authority was questioned until people learned his true identity and position. "Your Honor, my name is General Robert Hayes," he said in a voice that seemed to fill every corner of the courtroom. "United States Army retired. I served our country for 35 years, including the last 10 as a 4-star general. I am here today because Sergeant Marcus Washington served under my direct command in Afghanistan." A gasp went through the courtroom as people began to understand the significance of what they were witnessing. The bailiff straightened up and looked at the general with new respect. Even the young prosecutor looked up from her paperwork with surprise written across her face. Judge Holbrook felt her mouth go dry as she realized that a retired 4-star general was standing in her courtroom. She had never encountered anyone of such high military rank in all her years on the bench. General Robert Hayes stepped forward with the commanding presence that had made him one of the most respected military leaders of his generation. At 72 years old, he still carried himself like the soldier he had been for most of his adult life. His voice filled the courtroom with an authority that came from decades of making life and death decisions on battlefields around the world. "Your Honor, I did not come here today to interfere with your court or to question your authority," General Hayes said with perfect respect. "But I could not sit quietly and watch a good man be treated unfairly when I have personal knowledge of his character and service to our country." Judge Holbrook found herself speechless for one of the few times in her 20-year career on the bench. She had never imagined that a 4-star general would walk into her courtroom to defend a defendant she had already decided was guilty. Her anger toward Marcus began to fade as she realized she might have made a serious mistake. General Hayes turned slightly so he could look at both the judge and Marcus as he continued speaking. His words were measured and careful, but there was no doubt about the sincerity behind them. "Sergeant Marcus Washington served under my command during some of the most dangerous combat operations in Afghanistan," the general explained. "He was part of the 82nd Airborne Division and was deployed to Kandahar province during a height of Taliban resistance in that region." Marcus felt tears beginning to form in his eyes as he listened to his former commanding officers speak about their time together in combat. He had not seen General Hayes since the ceremony where he had received his Bronze Star, but he had never forgotten the respect and dignity with which the general had always treated every soldier under his command, regardless of their rank or background. The general continued his testimony with the precision of someone who had given many important briefings during his military career. On March 15, 2008, Sergeant Washington's unit was conducting a routine patrol through a village near Kandahar when they were ambushed by Taliban fighters from 3 different directions. Sarah wiped away her tears as she listened to details about her husband's military service that he had never shared with her. Marcus had always been modest about his combat experience and had never wanted to worry her with stories about the dangers he had faced overseas. "The ambush lasted for nearly 2 hours," General Hayes said, looking directly at Judge Holbrook. "Several soldiers were wounded and trapped behind cover, with no way to reach safety. Sergeant Washington crawled through enemy fire 3 separate times to rescue his wounded comrades. Even Officer Stevens, who had been sitting quietly in the front row, seemed moved by the general's description of Marcus' heroic actions in combat. The young police officer began to realize that he had arrested someone who had risked his life to save others and had been recognized for extraordinary bravery. General Hayes' voice grew stronger as he described the most important details of that day in Afghanistan. Sergeant Washington used his own body as a shield to protect a wounded private who had been shot in the leg. When the fighting was over, 11 soldiers owed their lives to his courage and quick thinking under fire. The courtroom was completely silent as everyone absorbed the magnitude of what they were learning about Marcus. This was not the troublemaker that Judge Holbrook had imagined when she saw the charges against him. This was a genuine American hero who had put his life on the line to save his fellow soldiers. I personally pinned the Bronze Star for Valor on Sergeant Washington's uniform during the award ceremony. General Hayes continued. In my 35 years of military service, I met very few soldiers who demonstrated the level of courage, integrity, and selfless service that Marcus Washington showed every single day. Judge Holbrook felt a deep sense of shame beginning to wash over her as she realized how badly she had misjudged the man standing before her. She had been ready to send a decorated war hero back to jail for refusing to apologize for something he had not done. General Hayes looked directly at Marcus with the same respect he had always shown to the soldiers who served under his command. Sergeant Washington has never been anything less than a model of honor and integrity. He would never show disrespect to a police officer or anyone else in a position of authority. The general then turned back to face Judge Holbrook with an expression that was both respectful and determined. Your Honor, I am not here to tell you how to run your courtroom, but I felt it was important for you to know exactly who Sergeant Washington is and what he has done for our country before you make any decisions about his case. General Hayes finished speaking, and for a moment the courtroom remained completely silent. Everyone present seemed to understand that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The distinguished military leader had traveled to this small courthouse for one reason only: to defend a soldier who had served with honor under his command. Then, in a moment that would be remembered by everyone in that courtroom for the rest of their lives, General Hayes did something that no one expected. He turned to face Marcus directly, and his expression changed from that of a man addressing a court to that of a commanding officer recognizing one of his finest soldiers. The general straightened to his full height and brought his heels together in perfect military fashion. His right hand rose sharply to his forehead in a crisp, precise salute that demonstrated decades of military training and tradition. The movement was so sudden and powerful that it seemed to electrify the air in the small courtroom. Sergeant Washington, it is my honor to serve alongside men like you, General Hayes said in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the room. His salute remained steady and unwavering as he looked Marcus directly in the eyes with unmistakable respect and admiration. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat as he saw his former commanding officer saluting him in front of all these people. For a moment he was transported back to Afghanistan and all the ceremonies where he had received recognition for his service. But this salute meant more than any medal or ribbon he had ever been awarded, because it came at a moment when he needed it most. Despite the handcuffs that still bound his wrists, Marcus managed to bring his own hand up to his forehead in a return salute. His movement was not as crisp as it would have been with his hands free, but the respect and military bearing were unmistakable. Tears began flowing freely down his cheeks as he responded to his general. Sir, it was my honor to serve under your command, Marcus said in a voice that was thick with emotion. Thank you for being here today when I needed you most. The exchange between the two soldiers lasted only a few seconds, but it transformed the entire atmosphere in the courtroom. Sarah was crying openly now, but these were tears of pride and relief rather than fear and worry. She had never seen her husband receive the recognition he deserved for his military service, and she felt her heart swelling with love for both men. Judge Holbrook sat behind her bench feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her entire career. She was witnessing a display of honor and mutual respect between two soldiers who had served their country with distinction. The contrast between their dignity and her own behavior over the past hour was impossible to ignore. Officer Stevens looked down at his hands as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He had arrested a decorated war hero for simply asking questions about his constitutional rights. The young police officer began to understand that his eagerness to prove himself had led him to treat a good man with disrespect and suspicion. The bailiff, who had been watching Marcus carefully for any sign of trouble, now looked at him with completely different eyes. This was not a criminal or a troublemaker. This was someone who had risked his life to save others and deserved to be treated with honor rather than suspicion. Even the other defendants waiting for their cases to be called seemed moved by what they were witnessing. Several of them had served in the military themselves, and they understood the significance of seeing a four-star general salute a sergeant in a civilian courtroom. General Hayes finally lowered his hand from his salute, but he continued to look at Marcus with the same respect he had always shown to the soldiers who served under his command. The general had not planned to make such a dramatic gesture when he entered the courtroom, but seeing Marcus being treated unfairly had stirred something deep in his military soul. The silence in the courtroom stretched on as everyone tried to process what they had just witnessed. This was not something that happened in normal court proceedings. This was a moment of honor and recognition that transcended the usual business of judges and lawyers and criminal charges. Judge Holbrook finally found her voice, but when she spoke it was in a tone completely different from the harsh, angry words she had been using earlier. The transformation in her attitude was obvious to everyone present, as she prepared to address both men with the respect they deserved. Judge Holbrook took a long, deep breath and set down her gavel with trembling hands. The weight of her mistake pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy coat that she could not remove. For 20 years she had prided herself on running a fair courtroom, but today she had failed in the most fundamental way possible. She had judged a man without listening to his story. General Hayes, Sergeant Washington, she began in a voice that was barely above a whisper. I owe you both a profound apology. This court has made a terrible error in judgment today. The judge looked directly at Marcus, and for the first time since the proceedings had begun she saw him as a human being rather than just another defendant. She saw the dignity in his posture despite the handcuffs and the orange jumpsuit. She saw the quiet strength that had carried him through 3 combat deployments and helped him save the lives of 11 fellow soldiers. Sergeant Washington, all charges against you are hereby dismissed, Judge Holbrook announced in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom. Your service to this country is noted and deeply appreciated by this court. You have conducted yourself with honor throughout these proceedings, even when you were not treated with the respect you deserved. Marcus felt his knees go weak with relief as he heard the words he had been hoping for since this nightmare began. The charges that had threatened to destroy his reputation and his future were gone. More importantly, his character had been vindicated in front of everyone who had witnessed his humiliation. The bailiff immediately stepped forward to remove the handcuffs from Marcus' wrists. As the metal restraints fell away, Marcus rubbed his sore wrists and stood even straighter than before. He was no longer a defendant in orange jail clothes. He was once again Sergeant Marcus Washington, decorated combat veteran and American hero. Judge Holbrook was not finished with her public acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done. She turned her attention to Officer Stevens, who was sitting in the front row looking deeply uncomfortable about his role in the arrest. Officer Stevens, you will report to your supervisor first thing Monday morning, she ordered in a firm voice. You will undergo additional training in community relations, de-escalation techniques, and constitutional rights. This department needs to do better in how it treats all citizens, especially those who have served our country with distinction. The young police officer nodded his understanding, though he could barely bring himself to look at Marcus. Officer Stevens was beginning to realize that his career in law enforcement would be defined by how he learned from this mistake. He would need to prove that he could be the kind of police officer that communities deserve rather than the kind who created problems through poor judgment. General Hayes walked over to Marcus and extended his hand for a firm handshake that lasted several seconds. Son, never let anyone make you apologize for standing up for what is right, the general said quietly so only Marcus could hear. That is exactly what we fought for overseas, and that is what makes this country worth defending. Marcus gripped his former commander's hand and felt strength flowing back into his spirit. Thank you, sir, he replied with genuine gratitude. Thank you for believing in me when no one else would listen. Sarah rushed forward from the back of the courtroom and threw her arms around her husband in an embrace that expressed all the fear and worry and relief she had been feeling. She had watched the man she loved stand up for his principles, even when it seemed like the whole world was against him. Now she was seeing him vindicated and honored as he deserved to be. As the couple embraced, the other defendants in the courtroom began to applaud spontaneously. They had witnessed something remarkable, the triumph of truth and justice over prejudice and hasty judgment. Several of them were veterans themselves, and they understood the significance of what had just happened. Word of the incident spread quickly through the small community over the following days and weeks. The local newspaper wrote a front-page story about the decorated veteran who had been wrongly arrested and the 4-star general who had come to his defense. The story sparked important conversations about respect, justice, and the treatment of military veterans. Marcus returned to his job at the hardware store with his head held high and his faith in the system partially restored. He knew that not every person who faced unfair treatment would have a 4-star general appear in court to defend them. But he also knew that standing up for what is right is always worth the risk, even when the outcome is uncertain. The incident changed everyone who was present in the courtroom that day. Judge Holbrook became known for taking extra time to listen to defendants before making judgments. Officer Stevens grew into the kind of police officer who earned respect through fairness rather than intimidation. And Marcus continued to serve his community with the same quiet dignity he had shown on the battlefield and in the courtroom where justice finally prevailed.